Hello and welcome to this lesson on designing curriculum and lessons. Breaking curriculum up into manageable units that can be learned in one sitting is important to developing larger courses, workshops, and other learning design products. This session will help you design the most fundamental unit of curriculum planning, the lesson. Hopefully, you'll remember from prior lessons that we learned about design processes like EDCI. In today's lesson, we'll build on this process by looking at how to plan lessons and learning objects during the design stage. You should also recall some of the main instructional strategies from major educational theories like behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructionism, as we'll be discussing and using them today. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe and apply the various stages of the BOPS lesson planning model, write learning outcomes using Bloom's taxonomy that target specific levels and domains of learning, and apply one or more assessment strategies to your lesson planning. Hopefully, you remember from the prior lesson on the EDCI process that after the initial analysis stage, you should have a fairly good idea of your audience and the content that they need to learn. Whether designing lessons for workshops and courses or learning products for other delivery models, your goal in the design stage that follows is to plan units of learning that can be consumed by your audience. Throughout the rest of this video, I'll call these units of learning lessons, although they may take other forms like workshop sessions, an instructional video, and so on. BOPS is an acronym that stands for the various stages or elements that should be present in a lesson or learning object. According to the BOPS model, a lesson should include a bridge, which hooks your audience, outcomes, which say what they're going to learn, pre-assessment, which asks what they know, participation, which helps them learn, post-assessment, which asks what they learned, and a summary, which makes the learning relevant to life and to future lessons. Although the order of these elements may vary, each of these elements should be present in some form. The bridge establishes the importance of the lesson and helps to engage and motivate the learners. Ideally, it should link the lesson to the learner's goals, prior experience, and prior learning. Like a chain, it also needs to be carefully linked to the learning topic and outcomes. A good bridge draws your audience into the topic. It could be a relevant story or joke, questions and answers, relevant multimedia, a metaphor or poem, a discussion or chat, or a purpose statement that explains how the learning helps the audience. Outcomes are like a contract between learners and teachers, holding all parties accountable to what should be taught, learned, and assessed. Again, like a chain, there must be a connection between what is taught, learned, and assessed, and outcomes are the primary tool to ensure that those links are strong. Outcomes should contain verbs that demonstrate a measurable and observable action. Later in this video, we'll learn how these verbs should also signify various levels and domains of learning. Here are some examples. By the end of this lesson, students will be able to list each element of the BOPS model, explain the function of each BOPS element, and create a lesson using BOPS. Notice that each of these outcomes gets successively harder, signifying higher levels of learning. Pre-assessment helps teachers know their learners before teaching them. Most importantly, knowing your learners beforehand can help you level or adapt your instruction to better meet their needs, goals, learning styles, and aptitudes. This can also help you find class experts who can support their peers, as well as link content from your lesson to what your students already know and care about. Examples include asking questions before a lecture or activity, using a quick survey or quiz, or applying a classroom assessment technique. We'll talk more about these techniques later in this lesson. Just as your bridge must be relevant to your outcomes, so must be your pre-assessment. Your goal is to measure how well your learners can already achieve your learning outcomes, so asking general questions about the topic or partially relevant questions won't be helpful. Participation is when the learning happens. As we learned with learner-centered teaching and constructionism, ideally it allows learners to be actively involved with the teacher, other learners, and the content. Again, like a chain, the learning activities chosen must be clearly linked to the actions suggested in the learning outcomes. For each mode of delivery, there are many different options for keeping learners actively engaged with the content. When designing face-to-face learning, You can follow your lectures with guided and independent practice, and you can facilitate critical discussions and debates. You can demonstrate an activity and have learners model it, and so on. For other delivery models like online learning, you can have your learners research using a web quest. You can have them post reflections to a forum or use a journal over time to document their learning. Post-assessment helps both the teacher and learners gauge whether or not the outcomes have been achieved. There are many tools and strategies you can use to vary your assessment approach, including using rubrics, self and peer assessment, group projects, portfolios, problem-based or case-based projects, and so on. All of these strategies are examples of authentic assessment. Authentic assessment is a term used by educational theorists to refer to evaluation techniques that try to mirror real-world and personally relevant learning, and it's closely related to constructionism. Again, like a chain, your assessment must be clearly linked to your outcomes and associated activities. In later lessons, we'll learn about the different ways you can assess learners, for example, using multiple choice quizzes to assess low-level cognitive knowledge, essays to assess all levels of the cognitive and affective domains, or videos and podcasts to assess all domains and levels depending on the task or question. Lastly, the major goals of the summary is to reinforce the major outcomes and ideas in the lesson, to connect the lesson to future learning as well as the student's life, and to motivate students to use and apply what they learned. Example strategies for a summary is to revisit the purpose, outcomes, and key ideas of the lesson, to give tasks that encourage students to apply what they learned, and to introduce future lessons that link to what they learned. Some people critique BOPS for being a highly structured, teacher-driven, and behaviorist model. Each of these critiques can be true depending on how BOPS is used. It is highly structured, but designers can remain creative by using different techniques for each element. Designers and teachers do drive the outcomes and instruction in BOPS, but they can also use student-centered strategies to engage and empower learners. Lastly, because it focuses on learning outcomes that are predefined, measurable, and observable, BOPS is very behaviorist. Designers, however, can incorporate constructionist and authentic learning strategies if they want to. In summary, BOPS reminds us that there are several core elements to effective lesson design, but we must remember that we can play with the model to remain creative and flexible and meet the specific needs of our learners. Next, we're going to go into greater detail on writing outcomes with Bloom's taxonomy. You may find it useful to download BCIT's document on writing learning outcomes and refer to it while watching the video. You can find it on the course site below this lesson. First, it's important to understand what an outcome is. An outcome is an observable action or behavior that demonstrates learning. Because it's an action, outcomes contain verbs which are carefully chosen to define the observable behaviors which are relevant to the curriculum or lesson. Terms which are sometimes used instead of outcomes are learning objectives and learning goals, although educational theorists often differentiate between these terms. Benjamin Bloom is an educational psychologist who identified a way of classifying learning outcomes. He created a classification system called Bloom's taxonomy that allows people to target specific types and levels of learning based on the verbs that they use when writing their outcomes. For example, each of these outcomes begins with a different verb that targets a different type of learning. Students will be able to write learning outcomes using Bloom's taxonomy, create a lesson that meets predefined learning outcomes, and evaluate different types of learning within a course using Bloom's 3 domains. Using different verbs, each of these outcomes illustrates a different level of understanding about how to use outcomes as well as their relevance to teaching and learning. Bloom classified outcomes into 3 major domains: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. The cognitive domain relates to the acquisition and use of facts and concepts. The psychomotor domain relates to skills that learners demonstrate when doing or creating something. Lastly, the affective domain relates to attitudes and feelings within the learner. When you use a cognitive outcome, you want to measure how much knowledge a learner has on a topic and how they think with that knowledge. Within the cognitive domain, Bloom defines 6 different levels of knowing and thinking: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. These levels build in complexity and require learners to think more deeply about given facts and concepts. The knowledge level outcomes, for example, require learners to simply recall what they've been told. Application outcomes not only require learners to recall and comprehend facts or concepts, but to also use and apply them. Evaluation outcomes to the far right are the highest or deepest of all, requiring learners to judge the facts or concepts for their merit. This table, which can be found in the BCIT document referred to before, is especially useful because it lists the verbs which are associated with each level. This makes writing specific outcomes much easier, as we'll soon see. In the psychomotor domain, there are 7 levels which demonstrate successive competence with a skill or task. For example, perception level outcomes begin with learners being able to observe a skill or task. Later levels, like guided response, have learners imitate the skill or task until they can complete the task automatically. The highest levels in this domain have learners modifying and improving the skill or task. Again, notice the lists of verbs associated with each level. Using these verbs can help you target specific behaviors, which you can build in complexity as lessons and courses progress. Lastly, Bloom identifies 5 levels in the affective domain: receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, and internalizing, each of which illustrate how learners can take on new values. For example, in the receiving level, learners are aware and not in overt conflict with a value. They then develop their agreement with the value over higher levels until it is internalized to such an extent that it controls behavior. It's important to realize that all disciplines have these domains of learning, although some domains are stronger than others in each discipline. For example, in mathematics, the cognitive domain is very strong, although mathematicians still need to know psychomotor skills related to working with numbers, computers, and so on. They should also have several affective values internalized, for example, the importance of collaborating with other mathematicians and the importance of being an honest professional. Nursing, on the other hand, may be strong in the affective and psychomotor domains. Not only do they need to know many facts and concepts, but they must learn values that help them care about and deal professionally with patients, as well as the skills and tasks that they perform daily. In addition to Bloom's taxonomy, another tool you can use to improve your outcomes is the SMART acronym. As a teacher, once you've written an outcome in a chosen level or domain, the last thing to think about is how effective it is. You can use the SMART acronym to remember how to test for an outcome's effectiveness. The SMART acronym reminds us that outcomes need to be specific enough so that the precise action is clear to both the learner and teacher, measurable so that the teacher and learner can observe and assess the action, attainable within the constraints of time in the learning environment, relevant to broader curriculum outcomes and learning needs, as well as time-specific so that the teachers and learners know when the outcome must be reached. Using the SMART criteria, see if you can critique the following outcomes. By the end of this course, students will be able to learn Jane Vella's 12 Principles of Adult Learning. Students will be able to understand learning design, and students will be able to know the stages of the ADDIE process. The first outcome is specific, attainable, relevant, and time-specific, but the verb used, to learn, does not suggest a measurable or observable action. It should use a better verb like describe, define, or evaluate, all of which are within the cognitive domain. The second outcome fails the same test in that the verb to understand doesn't suggest a measurable action. This outcome may also fail the specific test in that it doesn't suggest what or how much about learning design the learner must know and demonstrate. In the same way, the third outcome is equally vague. To what degree should students know the topic? Each of these verbs, to learn, to understand, and to know, should therefore not be used when writing outcomes. We're now going to talk briefly about assessment so you can get a better idea of how you can gather data from your learners before and after learning activities. If you're like me, you're likely often frustrated with how you are marked and evaluated by teachers. But there's much more to assessment than marking, and if it's done correctly, it can serve your learners much more than it frustrates them. Besides evaluating performance, there are many reasons to assess. For example, to adjust your teaching practices to better meet the needs of your learners, to correct your learners' misunderstandings, to teach learners how to self-evaluate their work, and to measure and encourage growth. There are many types of assessment. Some types you've already encountered in this course. In this lesson, we'll talk about formative and summative assessment, teacher, peer, and self-assessment, pre- and post-assessment, and needs assessment. Formative assessment is when you gather information from your learners, but not for the purpose of grading them. It helps instructors change their course of action to be more effective because formative assessment can help to identify what needs to be taught as well as the best strategies to be used for specific learners in the course. Formative assessment can be done before, during, and after a lesson. Summative assessment might use some of the same tools as formative assessment, for example a quiz, but its only purpose is to evaluate and grade learner performance. In our institutions, we most often use grades in summative assessment, which serves to motivate learners. Many people are critical of the learning benefits of grading, however, as they're often inadequate in authentically describing or quantifying learning, and they promote extrinsic motivation rather than intrinsic motivation. Summative assessment is completed during or after courses and not before. There are also different types of assessment based on who is doing the assessing. Most often, the job of assessment is the teacher's. However, allowing opportunities for learners to assess their peers or their own work can help students develop self-guided learning skills. Peer and self-assessment can help students identify their own misunderstandings and mistakes so that they're better able to continue learning without the need for a teacher. Pre-assessment or assessment before a learning event takes place, and post-assessment, assessment after an event, are terms we've spoken of before when discussing lesson planning. As previously mentioned, both are important in determining the impact of the learning event. A final form of assessment is needs assessment. We've already discussed needs assessment in the learning principles and design process lessons, so I'm hoping you know what it is. If not, remember that needs assessment is done before curriculum design to determine the learning needs of the target audience. It's important to note that each of these types of assessment is valuable, but some types of assessment may be more difficult given the mode of delivery or type of learning object. Organizations can use face-to-face trainers, online assessors, self-evaluation tools, computer-assisted quizzes, and so on. The final topic we'll briefly discuss is using what we've learned today to design broader curriculum. Another way to picture BOPS is to think of it as a cycle. This is what one lesson would look like. You bridge your lesson, share your outcome, complete your assessments and activities, and return to your outcome to see if it was met by your learners in post-assessment. If it wasn't, you may need to plan alternative activities and assessments and follow the cycle again until the outcome is met. With the addition of successive lessons, you can start to see how the outcomes build on one another to achieve more complex or higher order learning. Once the outcomes of the lesson 1 are reached, you can use a summary and bridge that link the first lesson to the lesson 2, and the cycle starts again. You can see how ordering the lessons and the lesson outcomes becomes very important within the broader context of reaching course outcomes. Bloom's taxonomy also suggests how you can also sequence outcomes to work towards higher order learning. Our first lesson cycle might work towards comprehension outcomes. Once learners achieve these outcomes, the second lesson can work towards analysis outcomes. Finally, the third lesson could work towards evaluation outcomes. In this way, teachers can link lessons to work towards higher order course level outcomes. For example, you might have learners define and describe the BOPS elements in Lesson 1. In Lesson 2, you might have them compare two different BOPS lessons to see how elements can be different. In your last lesson, you might have them design a lesson and then evaluate it for its pedagogical strengths and weaknesses. In summary, as designers, we need to recognize that designing units of learning requires that we incorporate several elements into our learning plans, including connecting to our learners' prior and future learning, activities that help learners practice and apply their learning, and assessing before and after learning events. The BOPS model, Bloom's taxonomy, and SMART criteria are useful tools to help you do this. Your tasks now are to write the outcomes for your lesson using BCIT's Writing Learning Outcomes handout below this video. Remember that you want to use a specific verb from Bloom's taxonomy to target one or more learning domains and levels. Remember also to be careful not to use verbs like to know, to learn, and to understand. Then, you should download the BOPS lesson planning worksheet below this video and plan your lesson based on your outcomes and the content you researched for your learning theory or design framework. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via email.